Hey there, Georgie girl, swinging down the street so fancy free. Nobody you meet could ever see the loneliness.
There was a time when music didn't come from earbuds or smartphone screens. It came from a wooden radio in the corner of the kitchen, from dusty cassette tapes in plastic boxes, or from a heavy TV set that the whole family waited around for the music program to start. Amidst those familiar sounds, a crystal-clear female voice would sometimes float through. Gentle, warm, the kind that made you pause while mopping the floor or hold your breath in front of the screen. That was the Seekers. So subtle you might not have noticed their name, but their melodies stayed with you. The Seekers were the first Australian band to do the unthinkable, conquer international music charts. With nothing more than acoustic guitars and simple harmonies, they managed to outshine the Beatles and the Rolling Stones in the UK, becoming national icons in the 1960s. At the center of it all was Judith Durham, a petite woman with a soaring, pure voice that could stop people mid-step. In a world constantly rushing forward, Judith's voice made you slow down just to listen. No gimmicks, no scandals, just a chorus that you could hum for years. If you've ever heard Georgie Girl or I'll Never Find Another You on the radio or in an old film, you've already met them, even if you didn't know their names. The Seekers weren't about flash or spectacle. They slipped into people's lives through sound, through memory, through the calm sweetness of a slower world. But like every song, their story wasn't all high notes. In 1968, the Seekers disbanded at their peak when Judith unexpectedly left the group. She wanted her own path, and though the other three tried to carry on, they never recaptured the magic. Their reunions were met with applause, but always carried a trace of something lost. In 1990, Judith was in a serious car accident that left her with major head and neck injuries. Surgery saved her life, but recovery meant relearning how to walk, talk, and eventually sing. And all the while, Judith had quietly battled chronic lung disease since childhood. A cruel twist for someone whose breath had carried a generation's soundtrack. In the years that followed, the Seekers occasionally reunited. Their performances were nostalgic, their smiles familiar. But the golden days were gone, and something had shifted that would never quite return. In 2022, Judith Durham passed away at 79. No fanfare, no excessive mourning, just enough silence for the world to remember how deeply it once loved that voice. Follow Farewell Aussie Stars to delve into the hidden tragedies behind some of the most beloved icons of a generation. Before stepping onto the world's big stages with the Seekers, Judith Durham was simply Judith Mavis Cock, a girl born in 1943 in Essendon, a suburb of Melbourne, into an ordinary middle-class family. From childhood, she lived with weak lungs as a result of a bout of measles, her breaths always shorter than other people's. Yet within that imperfect body, her voice grew strong, high, bright, and remarkably controlled. Playing the piano, singing in the choir, performing in school. These became the places where Judith escaped from her bouts of breathlessness and focused entirely on music. As she got older, Judith worked by day at an advertising agency, and at night and on weekends, she sang jazz with Frank Trainor's Jazz Preachers. Amid the thick jazz tunes and swirling cigarette smoke, her voice still stood out, pure and clear, utterly unlike the dark, somber atmosphere of the jazz clubs. It was at that advertising office that she met Athol Guy, a tall, bespectacled man who split his time between advertising and playing music with two old friends, Keith Potger and Bruce Woodley. Their group, initially called the Escorts and later renamed the Seekers, had recently lost its lead singer after the original vocalist left to get married. That chance meeting would prove to be a major turning point for all four of them. Athol invited Judith to audition with the group. The three young men from Melbourne Boys High School thought it was just a test run, but the moment Judith began to sing, everything almost effortlessly fell into place. Her crystal-clear soprano soared above their three-part male harmonies, creating a sound unlike any other folk band around Melbourne. They were still four ordinary people, but the sound they made showed that they could go far beyond the small pubs they were used to playing. Thanks to her connections from the jazz days, Judith helped the group land their first recording contract with W&G Records. They recorded an album, introducing the Seekers, along with a few singles like Waltzing Matilda and Kumbaya. They weren't stars yet, but before long their songs were on the radio and they were performing in local coffee houses. This was when the band learned how to hold a stage together. Athol remained steady on the double bass, Bruce and Keith laid down a solid guitar foundation, and Judith stood in the middle with tambourine in hand, all while trying to hide the fact that each time she took a breath, it strained her fragile lungs. Despite their growing popularity, the group still regarded themselves as semi-professional, office workers by day, performers by night. The turning point came in 1964, when they accepted an offer to perform as the onboard entertainment on a ship called the Fair Sky, bound for England. It was supposed to be just a working holiday, playing music in exchange for passage, spending about 10 weeks in London, then returning to their old jobs. But they brought along a demo recording to send to a management agency in the UK as a small wager on the band's future. The ship departed Melbourne Station Pier, carrying four performers accustomed to small stages, straight into entirely unfamiliar territory. On deck, they were still just the Seekers from Melbourne, playing simple acoustic folk tunes as Judith's voice drifted on the ocean breeze. No one realized that this trip was about to become a giant leap. In England, they were invited onto television, met Tom Springfield, recorded I'll Never Find Another You, and began a journey that would carry their name to millions. But that is a story for the next part, when the music reaches its peak and the quiet cracks within the group begin to appear. When the Fair Sky finally docked in England, the Seekers still thought they'd be in London for a few weeks, then head back to Australia with nothing more than a good working holiday story. But the recording session at Abbey Road with songwriter-producer Tom Springfield changed everything. I'll Never Find Another You was released at the end of 1964, and by early 1965 had gone straight to #1 in the UK, topped the charts in Australia, and reached the top 5 in the US. From a band who'd basically sung to pay for their boat tickets, they suddenly became the first Australian pop group with a global hit, appearing on television in Britain and America, and racing from show to show all over Europe. The success didn't stop there. The next singles, A World of Our Own and The Carnival Is Over, kept them on the radio and in the charts, turning the name The Seekers into a familiar presence in mid-60s pop. Then came Georgie Girl, the title song for the film of the same name, which unexpectedly became their biggest explosion. Top 10 in multiple countries, their highest charting hit in America, and even an Oscar nomination for Best Original Song. The four friends who'd once played folk around Melbourne now saw themselves up on cinema screens and in major TV specials, a level of visibility almost no Australian act had reached before. That peak took on an almost iconic quality when they came home. In 1967, the Seekers staged their Music for the People concert at the Sydney Myer Music Bowl in Melbourne, drawing an estimated crowd of more than 200,000, a figure later recorded as the largest audience for a concert in the Southern Hemisphere at the time. The televised special of that night drew millions of viewers. And soon after, the group were jointly named Australians of the Year, the first pop band ever to receive the honor. From a ship's entertainment gig, they had become the faces of a modern, outward-looking Australia in the eyes of the world. From the outside, it looked like a perfect curve. From tiny bars to television. From small Melbourne studios to Abbey Road. From the pier at Port Melbourne to the Myer Music Bowl with a sea of people below. But inside, the cracks were starting to show. The frantic schedule of a hot group meant planes, hotels, interviews, TV shows, studios, and stages chained together with barely a pause. For Judith, who'd grown up in the more intimate world of jazz clubs, that pressure felt both unfamiliar and suffocating. She began to feel boxed into the role of the sweet folk pop girl, while her heart leaned more towards jazz, blues, and smaller rooms where people came to really listen, not just to see the latest phenomenon. The chronic lung condition she'd carried since childhood didn't magically disappear just because the Seekers were famous. If anything, the constant travel, changing climates, and dense touring made Judith's body work harder than ever. She rarely complained in public, but backstage the others saw the tiredness, the coughing fits, the moments where she simply ran out of breath. The voice stayed clear and steady, but the price she paid to keep it that way grew higher with each passing year. No one could honestly pretend they were fronting a pure and effortless band when its center was a woman living with an unpredictable lung disease. Pressure, illness, and the feeling of being pulled too far from the path she really wanted slowly gathered inside Judith. In 1968, while the hits were still spinning on the airwaves, she decided to leave the Seekers to pursue a solo career, returning to jazz and to spaces that suited her better. That decision meant the group would stop. They recorded the TV special, The World of the Seekers, played farewell concerts, and announced their split to a stunned fan base. A band at the top of its game, choosing to step off the stage of its own accord. From the outside, it was just the news that a singer had left a group. To those close to them, it was the inevitable result of a fault line that had been running through their peak years, finally breaking open. By this point, the Seekers had everything a band could reasonably dream of. Global hits, record-breaking crowds, national honors. But those blazing years had also sown enough pressure, exhaustion, and difference to set up the fade to black that would follow. The rest of the story is what happens when the lights change color, when the tragedies start to take clearer shape through accidents, illness, and the long, slow descent of each person after the peak has passed. After the Seekers first broke up, each member drifted onto their own path. Judith stepped into a solo career and returned to jazz, the music she'd always felt closest to. Through the 1980s, she and her husband, who was also her closest musical partner, traveled between the UK, Europe, and Australia with smaller, more intimate shows. The schedule was gentler. No more seas of faces like the old Seekers days. But in exchange, she gained something else: control. She could choose the songs, the venues, the way she wanted to tell her story on stage. Her lung condition was still there, occasionally reminding her of its presence with a coughing fit or a shortness of breath. But Judith had long since learned to live with it as part of her body's personality. To her, this period felt like a rare moment of balance. She was still singing, but no longer trapped in a machine that was too big and too fast. Then, one day in the early 1990s, on a highway leading out of Melbourne, the car carrying Judith, her husband, and her manager was suddenly hit head-on by another vehicle. The impact was so severe that the driver of the other car died at the scene. Judith was left badly injured, with serious trauma to her head and neck that required urgent medical intervention. For drivers passing by, it was just another major accident on a freeway. Shattered glass, twisted metal, ambulance sirens cutting through the air. But for the small world orbiting around Judith, that moment snapped the straight line of her life in half, turning a journey that had been difficult but manageable into a steep, unpredictable descent. In the first days in hospital, Judith couldn't fully grasp how serious the damage was. The haze of painkillers, the constant beeping of machines, and the harsh white light all blurred together. It was only when doctors began talking about retraining, rehab, trying to read simple passages again, that the reality sank in. The accident hadn't just attacked her health, it had scrambled the most basic skills she'd relied on for decades. The woman who had memorized hundreds of songs, who could stand on stage and glance at a lyric sheet once before letting her voice lead the way, now had to sit in front of simple printed pages and wrestle with each word. For the seekers, even though by then each of them had their own life, the accident rang like an alarm, pulling them all back to a single question. What exactly had they gone through together, and how far had they pushed, or allowed themselves to be pushed, towards the edge? Judith had always been the center, the voice they leaned on. Now the question was brutally simple. Would she ever be able to stand on any stage again? The crash didn't wipe out Judith's career, but it did slow every step that followed. She did come back to singing. She still took part in special performances, and there were still times when she stood alongside the seekers at reunion events. But each time she walked on stage, she was more aware of her limits. The weak lungs she'd had since childhood, the lingering damage from the accident, the steady creep of age. She was no longer the young woman at Abbey Road, belting out song after song without thinking about tomorrow. Every performance from then on was a calculated choice between I can and I should stop here. In her final years, Judith continued to face more health problems. The chronic lung disease never went away. It could only be managed. Every flare-up left her a little weaker, and public appearances became fewer and further between. By the time news broke in 2022 that Judith Durham had died from complications of lung disease, many fans were jolted into looking back. In their memories, she was still the crystal-clear voice of old, but in reality, that body had been straining against illness for almost an entire lifetime. That moment felt like the stage lights cutting out more decisively than in any previous breakup or hiatus. The 1968 split had still left a door open for reunions and anniversary shows. The 1990 accident had still left room for hope, because after rehab, Judith did manage to return, even if at a different pace. But her death in 2022 did not. From that day on, there was no possible universe in which the four of them could stand together on a stage again. The seekers, who had already been living mostly in nostalgia, stepped fully into the realm of memory. The recordings are still there. The voice still rings out on vinyl, on radio, under old TV footage. But the person who created it is not. In that sense, Fade to Black isn't just the moment of a near-fatal crash, or the day a singer takes her last breath in a hospital. It's the entire process of the light slowly withdrawing from a band. For the seekers, that arc has run its course. They climbed astonishingly high, were cut off mid-ascent, flickered back to life now and then, and in the end came to a complete stop when the voice at the center was gone. What remains is the echo, the way family, bandmates, fans, and the whole of Australia look back on what the group left behind, and the way a string of quiet tragedies forced an entire industry to think differently about the people who stand in front of the microphone. When news broke in August 2022 that Judith Durham had died at 79. Most people only saw a few short lines in the paper or online. Complications from chronic lung disease, passed away at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne. But beneath those brief notices was a wave of grief that rolled right across Australia. The Victorian government held a state memorial for her at Hamer Hall, where friends, family, former colleagues, and fans gathered to farewell the golden voice of the Seekers. At that service, Athol Guy introduced what would be the group's final recording, Carry Me. Judith had laid down her vocal earlier. The three men finished the harmonies and instrumentation after she was gone. It was their way of standing together one last time, even though the distance between them now wasn't measured in meters, but in the line between life and death. For the surviving bandmates, the shock of that loss was more than a private sorrow. For years, Athol, Bruce, and Keith had grown used to revisiting the past through reunion tours, compilation albums, and retrospective interviews. After 2022, anything connected to the name The Seekers carried an added weight. Anytime a song was played, anytime old footage was shown, it became part of one long goodbye. They kept turning up at tribute events, giving interviews, appearing on specials, not to squeeze a little more out of their careers, but to guard the memory of a band whose center would never sing again. On a broader level, Judith's death prompted a fresh look at the Seekers' place in Australian music. Back in the 1960s, they were the first Australian pop group to really break through in both the UK and the US, opening the door for a whole generation of artists to head overseas. They'd long since been named Joint Australians of the Year in 1967, inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame and the Music Victoria Hall of Fame, and often described as the ones who laid the first bricks for Australian popular music on the global map. For a while, those honors had faded into the background noise of history. But after Judith passed, newspapers and TV networks started retelling the story, and a younger wave of listeners began digging back through the catalog to find out what, exactly, those four had done to earn that kind of respect. Their legacy isn't just in records or awards. Songs like I'll Never Find Another You, A World of Our Own, The Carnival Is Over, and Georgie Girl keep turning up on radio playlists, in films, and in cover versions by later performers. Some faithful to the originals, some completely reimagined. For many people, those tracks are pinned to one specific memory. A car trip, a night in the lounge room, a cassette their parents played over and over. For younger musicians, the Seekers stand as proof that four ordinary-looking people with acoustic instruments can still conquer the world's stages if they find a sound that truly belongs to them. And Judith, after she was gone, came to be remembered as more than just the lead singer. She became a symbol of endurance. People talked about how she carried a lung condition from childhood, yet still managed to sing those long, effortless lines. About how she survived a car crash, then patiently learned to read, speak, and sing again, so she could stand in front of a microphone one more time. About how she spent the rest of her life performing, doing charity work, receiving medals and honors, and eventually being named Victorian of the Year, recognized not only for her music, but for her contribution to the community. The image of this small woman, with a voice stronger than her own body, turned into a rare kind of role model. No noise, no scandal, just decades of quiet persistence. Even the physical places that shaped them have gradually been turned into shared memory. In 2025, a street in St. Kilda, where Judith once owned a house and where the group often met to rehearse, sign contracts, and get ready for tours, was renamed Seekers Way by the local council. The new street sign isn't just there to stop people confusing it with another road. It's a very concrete way of saying, a music story passed through here. For the three men still alive, it's one of the strangest honors of all. An entire career summed up in the name of a small, one-way street. As they've joked themselves, Seeker's Way only runs in one direction: forward. Looking back, the price of that journey was anything but small. A band breaking up at full flight. A woman living her entire life with lung disease. A recovery from a car crash that would have been a whole story on its own. A voice that had to fight through challenge after challenge before finally falling silent. But it's precisely those fractures that give the legacy of the Seekers and Judith Durham its weight. They didn't just leave behind pleasant, easy-listening records. They left behind an example that a small band can open doors for a whole country, and that a fragile human being can stand firm for far longer than their body should reasonably allow. Today, if you happen to hear a Seekers song in a cafe, on the radio, or buried in the soundtrack of an old film, you're hearing more than just a tune from the 1960s. You're hearing the echo of a long, scratch-marked journey that ran for more than half a century. What happens after that is up to each listener. You can let the song drift past your ears, or pause for a moment and ask yourself why those seemingly delicate melodies have managed to hold their ground for so long.